Hello. Welcome back, everybody, to HHH, the podcast where we talk about the horrible humans in history. I am your host, Angela Pearson, and in this podcast, we talk about the most despicable people that have ever lived and what they did that made them so despicable. So last time we talked about H.H. Holmes, and if you haven't taken a listen to that one, please do. It's a good one. It's a pretty good story. Today, we're talking about someone else that, I will be honest with you guys, this individual gave me more heebie-jeebies than H.H. Holmes, which I know is crazy, but it is a thing. So when you think of serial killers, and I promise, guys, we're not only going to talk about serial killers, but these first two individuals, I just had to go first with these guys because they are so horrible. But the individual we're talking about today, you always imagine serial killers being the people who, kill people for fun or are someone that is sneaking in the background and being all kinds of shady. This person, this is why they're so creepy. Not only are they someone that we are all taught to just inherently trust, but they kill people for the sexual thrill of it. It is horrible. And so this person, to me, is way worse than H.H. Holmes. You might have a different opinion, but we'll talk about this person and then you can decide for yourself what you think. But we are going to talk about Honora Kelly. Have you ever heard of Honora Kelly? No, that's because, again, this person changed their name, just like H.H. Holmes. They changed their name to Jane Toppan. Now, you might have heard of Jane Toppan. You might have heard of Jolly Jane Toppan, but that is who we are talking about. Here's a quote to start us off from Jolly Jane herself. She said, "I've killed more people, helpless people, than any other man or woman who ever lived." And she was proud of that fact, guys. And we're going to talk about what she means by helpless people, because genuinely, these people were helpless. So let's get into her life story and let's see what makes her so despicable. Jolly Jane is what she was called. We'll explain why. But she was born as Honora A. Kelly, or Nora for short. She was born in Boston, Massachusetts. They actually aren't sure exactly what year she was born because there are different records that say different times that she was born. One says March 13th, 1854, but other records say she was born in 1857. So we aren't actually sure the exact year that Jolly Jane was born, but it was somewhere in between 1854 and 1857. She was born to Peter Kelly and Bridget Kelly. They were poor Irish immigrants, so they came to the United States from Ireland and were struggling because I don't know if you're aware at this time in history in the 1800s, Irish people were looked down on pretty heavily and treated pretty terribly. I don't want to get into the details of it, but just know being Irish was not a good thing. It was not something that was desired or looked highly upon. So that's important to Jolly Jane's story, that she was born to an Irish immigrant family. Her mother, Bridget Kelly, actually died when Jane was just a year old of tuberculosis, or what a lot of people know as consumption. So she didn't ever get to know her mother. She never had an influence of her mother. So that is, again, there are so many little details that are important to this story, but she didn't have a good mother because she had passed away. And she didn't have a good father. Shockingly, her father, Peter Kelly, was a nasty drunk and a little bit crazy. He literally was known as Kelly the Crack, like crackpot, because he was insane at some point. So he actually worked as a tailor. And at one point, he tried to sew his own eyelids shut. Like, when I say he's crazy, he's legitimately crazy, guys. Like, not so. Cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. Crazy, okay? So he actually this crazy person was trying to take care of 3 to 4 daughters. In the research I was doing, it said 3 in some of the articles, it said 4 in others. So he was trying to take care of 3 to 4 daughters. And obviously, because he is a drunk, he neglected his children. He was not capable of taking care of his children at all. And so the state actually stepped in and took 2 of his girls away, and they were dropped off at the Boston Female Asylum. That happened in February of 1863. So it was Nora, so Jolly Jane, and her older sister, Delia. They were dropped off at this Boston Female Asylum. Now, when I heard asylum, I know you're thinking the same thing I did. I was picturing like those insane asylums where people were treated horribly and it was just a disaster and like insane asylum, right? That's not actually what it is. It's actually kind of like a halfway house for women and children where they were able to be taken care of and those kinds of things. So they were brought there. And I have a quote from the state. It said, whose habitants evidently rendered him an unfit protector for his girls. Their appearance indicated that they had been rescued from a very miserable home. That was from a worker in the Boston Female Asylum when they saw Delia and Nora for the first time, aka Jolly Jane. They were in such a miserable state and unkept and malnourished and everything that they literally made a comment on the records of how bad of shape they were in. So, in November of 1864, so really quick, I'll explain. In the Boston Female Asylum, they only kept children in the home until they were 10 years of age. So what they would try to do is place the orphan girls in homes. And if they weren't placed in a home, they were basically released onto the world when they turned 10 years old. So luckily for Jolly Jane, in November of 1864, I mean, luckily, I say luckily, but she became an indentured servant to Mrs. Anne C. Toppan. So indentured servants, just so you know, are basically like slaves who are working off a debt. And once they've worked off their debt, they are released of their servitude. So at 10 years old, Jolly Jane, was it 10? I can't remember. In 1864. So she was, so about 9-10 years old. She became an indentured servant. So she had to serve a family and work off a debt. Just kidding. Guys, I need to actually look at my notes because I wrote it down. She was 6 years old at this time. So it's more likely she was born in 1857 than 1854. See, math is hard. That's why I study history and horrible people, because I just can't do the math. Anyways, so she was under contract until she turned 18, but she served in the Toppan household for longer than that, but we'll get to that. So the debt Jane was actually paying off was being raised by this family, basically. So she actually did go to school. Mrs. Ann Toppan was pretty good to her, treated her fairly well in the sense of she made her go to school, she made her become educated, and she basically raised her as she would her own children. She did, in Jane's eyes, she was treated horribly by Mrs. Toppan. Like, she was never treated the same as Mrs. Toppan's girls, like her daughters, because Mrs. Toppan actually had a daughter named Elizabeth, and Jane considered Elizabeth her sister. It was Elizabeth that Jane became very jealous of because Mrs. Toppan treated her much better than Jane, but Elizabeth loved Jane and treated her just like a normal sister and loved her to death. And so that, again, is an important thing. In 1865, Nora officially changed her name to Jane Jenny Toppan. She was never officially adopted by the Toppan family, but she loved them so much and considered them to be her family that she officially changed her name to match their family. Not only that, she was very embarrassed by her Irish heritage and wanted to escape that because it was so looked down upon. She wanted to get rid of anything that signified that she was Irish. So, of course, she wanted to change her name. And Jane actually was a really good student and did really, really well in school. She was super, super smart. She was actually a really charming child as well. Like, everyone really liked her at first because she was super happy and inviting. But as time would go on, they'd realize that Jane was prone to telling lies, gossiping about others, and her popularity quickly declined because of this, because no one ever knew what to believe about Jane, like, because she always made up stories. So there is a quote here from a man who represented her at the trial. His name's Henry R. Stedman. So at her final trial when she got caught, he said, "Until Jane was a woman, she was under good moral and religious influences. Home surroundings and discipline had good associates, but her incorrigible propensity for deceit, falsehood, and troublemaking never absent from the first." So she was always trying to tell big tales. She told many lies about her parents, where she came from. That's just what she did. And then she loved causing drama between her friends. So she was not super popular because of that, but she was a very charismatic child. So people initially would really like her. At the age of 16, she actually fell in love and got engaged. I thought this was a really interesting, side note. The ring that she got for her engagement was actually shaped like a bird. Not a very important detail, but interesting. The boy that she was engaged to actually moved away and let her know that he had fallen in love with someone else. And that broke her. And a lot of people think that this breakup was the beginning of her downward spiral. There's even a quote from Jane herself saying that if she had ended up getting married and having a family, she wouldn't have done what she did because she would be too busy raising her family and taking care of her husband. So that kind of shows that this is probably where all of her craziness started. But as we already can see, a little bit of crazy already runs in her family. So at the age of 18, she was released from her indentured servitude after graduating from Lowell High School. She was given $50 from her mother. I've put mother in quotes. mother, the very loose term, she considered Mrs. Toppan her mother. Her mother, Mrs. Toppan, gave her $50, but she decided that she wanted to stay on as a servant, and she stayed on until she was about 25 years old. When Mrs. Toppan passed away, her daughter Elizabeth actually kept Jane on as help until Elizabeth herself got married and moved out. That is the point that Jane decided to leave and become a nurse. So this is what I'm talking about when I say this lady was someone that we're all taught to trust, literally with our lives. She decided to become a nurse. So she began her training at Cambridge Hospital in 1887. And this is where things start going south, guys. Get ready, buckle up. This is when it starts getting crazy. So she was a really good student, got really good grades, and she enjoyed two interesting classes, one of which I feel like is a repeat from H.H. Holmes. They both liked their autopsy, like cadaver classes a lot. But the other thing that Jane really, really liked was pharmacology. Basically studying how to use drugs and how to mix drugs and dosages and those kinds of things. She really, really enjoyed pharmacology. And I know I keep saying this, but that is important. She gained the nickname of Jolly Jane while she was in nursing school, because she would always come in and be so cheerful and was so willing to take on extra shifts, and everybody really liked her because she was just so happy and so kind to all the patients, and she just always was in a good mood and just jolly. So everyone started calling her Jolly Jane. But again, her old habits started showing up again, where she would start gossiping and lying, and she even started stealing from her fellow students. And so it started to rub all the other students the wrong way. They didn't like her as much because she would purposely turn her friends against each other just to watch the drama play out. I don't know if you guys have ever met anyone like that, but I have, and they are the worst. So people started not liking her. She often volunteered for extra shifts and stayed very late to help at the hospital. And this is when things take the turn, is she actually started experimenting on her patients. So her own patients, she was trying to help get better. She would experiment with atropine and morphine to figure out which doses were actually lethal of those drugs. So she would play with it, and she would bring them to the verge of being like their deathbed and then help them recover, because she also wanted to look like she was a really skilled nurse and was so good that people were miraculously getting better around her. But what was actually happening is she was drugging them and making them sick and poisoning them, and then easing off on the poisoning so they could get better. So she would actually falsify the patient's records to cover her tracks. Atropine and morphine, if you didn't know, are very hard to find in the body. That's why she preferred those instead of like arsenic or something like that. They were much harder to find and point as a means of death. So that's why she preferred those ones. So on top of this, like experimenting on her patients, Jane hated the elderly patients. Like, legitimately saw no point in their existence. So she would start killing off her elderly patients because she saw there was no purpose in helping them, because they were old and they didn't serve any purpose in the world. How messed up is that? Like, oh my gosh, this girl, I tell you what, oh my gosh. So she would use opium to poison these elderly students and killed minimum at least 12 patients while she was a student. She wasn't even an official nurse yet, and she killed at least 12 people while she was a student. Crazy. Now, here's a crazy story. So there was a girl named Amelia Finney. She actually had an operation done in 1887, and Jane was her nurse that was supposed to help her recover after the surgery. Well, she remembered Jane giving her this bitter medication in like fizzy water. Again, important detail. Fizzy water, bitter medicine. She drank it up, and then she started feeling really ill and was like coming in and out of consciousness. And she remembered Jane crawling into bed with her, stroking her face and saying, "It's all going to be okay soon. It's okay. It's all going to be okay." And then she lost consciousness. And before she lost consciousness, she heard a door open and Jane popped out of the bed immediately. She just jumped out as fast as she could. And then she lost consciousness. So when she woke up, she genuinely thought she dreamed it until 14 years later, when she testified at Jane's trial, that she remembered this happening while she was in the hospital. So Jane crawled into bed and was stroking her face, reassuring her that it was all going to be over soon and it was going to be okay. Creepy, creepy, creepy. So, some of the things that she didn't just poison patients that she didn't like the elderly. She also poisoned the patients she did like because she wanted them to stay in the hospital longer. So just like Amelia was not old at the time of her surgery. She was a young girl. So Jane did this because she liked her and wanted to keep her around longer. So she would keep poisoning them and then eventually help them get better to look like an amazing, miraculous nurse who could do anything. Outside of work, Jane liked to get drunk, tell dirty jokes, obviously gossip, and make her friends fight each other, basically causing drama in all of the friend groups. So it's not surprising that that's what one of her hobbies was. So after she studied at Cambridge for a little bit, she actually moved to the Massachusetts General Hospital to get her nursing hours before she could get her license. But in the Massachusetts General Hospital, they actually noticed Jane was falsifying records for her patients pretty quickly. And they also noticed that many of her patients were overdosing. But they stacked that up to Jane being incompetent because she was so nice and so kind and so sweet. There's no way there was anything nefarious behind these overdoses or the falsifying of records. She just must have been a complete idiot. That is what they thought. And eventually they excused her and she lost her position in Massachusetts because not only did they think she was incompetent, she actually got caught stealing jewelry from one of her patients, jewelry and money. So they started becoming a little more suspicious about the fact that she was stealing things, but they had no suspicion of her intentionally poisoning people. They just really thought she was stupid. So once she was excused from Massachusetts, she actually went back to Cambridge, the Cambridge Hospital. And again, immediately started poisoning the elderly and even trying to poison one of her fellow training nurses. And they quickly noticed that, again, she was falsifying records and had a higher mortality rate with her patients than anyone else. So they excused her pretty quickly as well. But again, they thought it was because she was incompetent. They didn't think there was any malice behind her behavior, which is so crazy. Like, there's a pattern here, but no one noticed it. And so they just truly thought she was an idiot or an imbecile. So she was not able to actually get her nursing license. So she decided to become a private nurse and work for families and that kind of thing. She actually became one of the most successful private nurses in Boston because of her demeanor. She was so kind and sweet. Initially, when you met her, people really enjoyed being around her. And so she became the nurse to Israel and Lovely Dunham. Gotta say it right. Israel was 83 years old and died pretty shortly after Jane became their nurse. She called him feeble and fussy. So it is believed that Jane killed him because we all know she did not have a liking of old people. And if he was fussy or feeble, that would have been her target. So he died pretty quickly after she started to be their nurse. And then Lovely, his wife, died 2 years later under the care of Jane. So once they had passed away, she actually decided that the next victim was going to be someone much closer to her. She rented out a cabin in Cape Cod and invited her sister, Elizabeth, the person who cared about her most in the world. She invited Elizabeth to come take a vacation with her in Cape Cod. And they spent a couple days together. It was basically a sister's trip in a cabin, and they were having fun. But after a few days, Elizabeth had an epileptic stroke and fell into a coma and died. Now, it is believed that Jane poisoned her, obviously. And the reason why they believe she poisoned her is because she was very jealous of Elizabeth and the attention that their quote-unquote mother gave her. Even though Mrs. Toppan was not Jane's mother, she was very jealous of Elizabeth and wanted the attention that Elizabeth was getting from their mother, but never received it. Even though Elizabeth treated Jane so well, she got so jealous that she killed her own sister, the only sister that she still had. Well, the next victim was Myra Connors. Myra was actually one of Jane's friends. She was the matron of St. John's Episcopal School and made a pretty good wage, had an apartment given to her, and a maid for that position. So Jane was very jealous and wanted that position for herself. So she bid her time, waited around, and then when Myra fell ill, Jane immediately volunteered to take care of her. It was like, oh, I got this. I will help her. I am a nurse. Let me help her feel better. And shockingly, you won't believe this, but Myra died in Jane's care. Shocker. So this is the part that kills me, and like, ugh, this person is horrible. So Jane pretended to be sad and grieved for her friend, and at the funeral told the dean of the school that Myra had actually been planning on taking a break and she was going to recommend Jane to fill her position until she returned. But sadly, she died before she was ever able to take that break or before she was able to recommend Jane. So the dean was like, you know what? Okay. Would you like to have this position? We need someone to fill it. Would you like to fill it? And this is her response. She said she had to accept the job because that is what Myra would have wanted. ew. Like, literally in my notes of my research, I put ew. Because it's just so despicable, like so horrible. Also, side note, at this moment, she was still renting out the cabin in Cape Cod. And this is important to know because this is going to lead to her downfall at some point. So she's still renting the cabin, even though she is now living in this apartment, working as the matron of St. John's Episcopal School. But after less than a year, she barely made it to a year, Jane was actually asked to resign from her post as matron due to terrible management skills. Shocker. So they made her leave, and now Jane was angry. And Jane is not someone that you want to make angry. And this is going to be really poor timing for this poor next victim. So the next victim, so we just mentioned that she's still renting that cabin. So the owner of the cabin is Maddie and Alden Davis. They had been renting the cabin to Jane and actually had waived rent for the cabin for a year so Jane could mourn the loss of her sister. You know, the one she murdered? They gave her a year off of paying rent for her grief. But at this point, it had been 2 years. So she started renting it in 1889, and it was now 1901, and she had not paid a cent of rent. So Maddie came to confront Jane. This is just after she had been released from her position. So Maddie came to confront Jane in person because no matter how they tried to reach out to her, letter, telegram, whatever, Jane would just ignore them. And so Maddie came in person to ask about the money since they couldn't get a hold of her any other way. Well, at this point, Jane had moved in with Eliza and Melvin Beadle and was acting as their nurse. And when Maddie arrived, Jane welcomed her in and gave her a fizzy water with a bitter taste. Where have we heard that before? So, shockingly, Maddie fell ill very soon after arriving to confront Jane, and a doctor was actually called in. The doctor came in and thought that Maddie was in really good hands with Jane because Jane was a nurse and left. Jane had actually told the doctor, you know what? Maddie is actually a diabetic. She ate some cake when she got here, and that's probably what it is. It's just because she has too much sugar. I can take care of her. You can leave. And the doctor was like, you know what? Okay. I feel confident in the abilities of this person, so I'm just going to head out. So the doctor left Maddie in Jane's hands. Now, Jane was very upset that Maddie had come to get that money. So instead of just killing her, Jane decided to torture Maddie. She tried different doses of drugs and would increase it, decrease it. So Maddie was just being tortured for a while until one day, eventually, the drugs and the pain just killed her. Now, the Davis family had no idea that this was happening. They thought that Jane had lovingly cared for their matron and was just so sweet and kind to care for their mother and wife in her last days. So they were big fans of Jane's, to the point they actually invited her to come and live with them and be their nurse. That's how much confidence they had in Jane. Well, this obviously made Jane a little cocky. She thought she was going to be able to get away with anything. And remember how we talked about atropine and morphine being hard to detect? that was her drug of choice when killing people. Well, Jane's starting to get cocky, and she hasn't been able to try some things. So it's important to note that Jane's going to start taking some risks with how she goes about killing people. So soon after Jane joined the Davis family, she actually started lighting fires around the house, like in the barn or in her room or in all these random places. She would just start fires, and she blamed some mysterious man that she had seen wandering around their property. And no one found this suspicious at all. There's many things about this whole case that just like blow my mind, because they were just like, oh yeah, she says there's a man running around setting fires, and she just happens to be around when that happens. Okay, cool. Yeah, I believe her. So as she was going around setting fires, she actually noticed that they had arsenic in the shed. Now, like I just mentioned, she primarily used morphine to kill her people. But she never used arsenic because it was kind of a heavy metal and easier to detect. But she saw it and was like, you know what? I've never gotten to try this. I really want to try it. So Maddie and Alden had 2 daughters. So Genevieve and Minnie were their daughters. They actually came and lived with Alden when Maddie had passed away because they wanted to help care for their father after the loss of his wife. So Genevieve was the most distraught because she was the closest to her mother. So she was just devastated at the loss of her mother. And Jane saw this and decided to use this to her advantage, obviously. So she started telling lies, saying, you know, I saw Genevieve eyeing that arsenic in the shed. We should keep an eye on her. She's super sad, and I know she's been looking at that arsenic. A few days later, Genevieve died of arsenic poisoning, and everyone deemed it as a suicide. Now, at this point in time, suicide was very taboo. You could not talk about it. You didn't want people knowing about it. So they just basically moved on and were like, she was very sad. So she definitely did this to herself. Well, 2 weeks, literally 2 weeks later, Alden would pass away. And people just assumed it was because of a broken heart over the loss of his wife and his daughter. See, I don't blowing my mind. First his wife, then his daughter, and now him. So Minnie is the only remaining family member at this point. She has just lost her mother, her sister, and her father. And she actually dies literally a few days after her father. And doctors said her death was caused by exhaustion. Apparently, they did a lot of research before deciding how people actually died in these times. I'm physically rolling my eyes right now. They didn't investigate at all. The whole family wiped out in less than 40 days. No one was suspicious. No one asked questions. It is nuts to me that no one thought anything weird was happening. So the reason why Jane actually killed Minnie was because Jane had tried to get Minnie to sign a legal document excusing Jane of all debts owed to the Davis family, and Minnie would not do it, which was the nail in Minnie's coffin, because she killed Minnie with morphine. So that's important. She did not use arsenic. She used morphine. And this is so horrible. The first dose she gave Minnie was not enough, and she had given it to her orally. It wasn't enough, but it made it so Minnie could not swallow. She was not able to swallow anymore because it had damaged her esophagus too badly. So Jane killed her using an enema of morphine. She used an enema to kill her, of morphine. I don't know why, that just gives me, the heebie-jeebies, because you're, humiliating this person as you're killing them. It's just the worst. So horrible. So now Jane's head is getting so big, she's getting so cocky, because she just got away with killing an entire family in less than 40 days. At least that's what she thinks. So, this is the beginning of Jane's downfall. So, Jane, at this point, moves back to her childhood home this is so gross, to woo Elizabeth, her sister's husband, Ormel Brigham. So, we're going to look into this a little bit more in a second, but there is suspicion raised. There are people who actually stop and think, this is very weird. So, Minnie's father-in-law, his name is Captain Paul Gibbs. He worked in the police force. Bless him, he was the first one to start suspecting Jolly Jane. And he started suspecting it almost immediately after Minnie's death. For example, he had been at Minnie's side and saw Jane inject something into Minnie's arm just before she died. And when he asked Jane, "Oh, what was that?" she just kind of, I don't know, just medicine. It's medicine. Okay, well, what kind of medicine? Oh, it's going to help her feel better. Okay, well, what is it? She's like, well, okay, well, just tell me what it is. And she would not tell him what was in the injection. So immediately he's like, that's suspicious. Then he heard his son mention that just before Minnie's death, she acted very scared of Jane. Anytime Jane would enter the room, she would cower away, or she acted very afraid of Jane. And those two things put together immediately raised red flags for him. In addition, there was a doctor, Ira Cushing. He also became suspicious of Jane because he had worked with the Davis family and knew that they were all healthy. So it was very strange that they all died. So Captain Gibbs and Dr. Cushing worked together and pooled their resources together, actually start investigating Jane. They even were able to get the bodies of Genevieve and Minnie exhumed, and toxicology tests were performed on both of them. So, Captain Gibbs even began following Jane to watch where she went and what she was doing and all of that. Jane didn't know any of this was happening. She, again, thought she got off scotch-free, killing all of this family. So she had already moved on and was trying to get the family estate. She wanted the Toppan estate to herself. That is why she went back to her home and tried to woo her sister's husband, because that would be the only way she would get access to the family fortune. So, first, Jane tried winning Ormel over by comforting him in his grief after she murdered his sister, Edna Bannister. So his sister had come to visit and was helping him after he lost his wife, Jane's sister, Elizabeth. So while she was there, Jane ended up poisoning her and killing her, and she tried comforting him and wooing him that way. Well, that did not work. So she started poisoning him. So his health went down, and she was nursing him back to health and hoping that would win him over. Well, that didn't work either. And she couldn't just kill him because then the estate would be lost to someone else. She would have no claim on it because she wasn't actually, an official relative of the Toppans. So she had to get him to accept her. But for some strange reason, helping him grieve the sister that she killed or trying to poison him didn't work. So her next step, obviously, was threatening to tell the town that she was pregnant with his child. Again, in my notes, I wrote, ew. Ew. Which, he obviously knew was not the truth. So that didn't work either. He was like, whatever, go ahead and tell them. No one's going to believe you. It's fine. So after that, he finally asked her to just leave. It's like, you know what? Just get out of here. I don't need you here. You can leave. So when that happened, Jane tried, and I'm putting this in quotation marks, tried to commit suicide with morphine. Now, we all know that Jane knows the lethal dose of morphine. I can't even say it. Guys, struggling. Lethal dose of morphine. She knows what that is. So if she was really trying to kill herself, she would have done it. But she ended up in Lowell General Hospital where she was treated. And then while she was there, she, quote unquote, tried a second time to take her life. This was just a way to get attention. And I'm guessing, again, trying to hope that Ormel will be like, oh, I shouldn't have turned you away. Come back. But it didn't work. So while she was recovering in the hospital, she didn't know that a detective had actually been admitted to the hospital to keep an eye on Jane. So he was a fake patient that was placed close enough to watch Jane because she didn't know that the investigation on her was heating up, and it was heating up very quickly because the toxicology reports had actually come back while Jane was in the hospital. And they found traces of arsenic in Minnie's system. So the day that Jane was released from the hospital, she was arrested by the police for the murder of the two sisters. Now, the news started to spread about Jane, this happy nurse that killed this family. So the reporters actually started digging into her past. So they were digging, and sometimes, it's good that reporters do this digging because they found some good information that we'll get to in a minute. So Jane actually served 7 months in jail before her case went to trial. And her trial lasted 8 hours, and the jury only took 27 minutes to decide her fate. So it was a pretty cut and dry trial. So let's go through this really quick. So when Jane's case went to trial, it seemed pretty open and shut. They had evidence that arsenic was in Minnie's body and also in Genevieve's body. So they figured Jane had to have killed them. Well, it turns out that the mortician who embalmed both of their bodies testified that the chemicals they used in embalming the bodies actually contained arsenic. This was devastating to the prosecution, totally devastating. Well, Jane thought she was going to get away with it because, they can't prove now that she did it because obviously the arsenic came from the embalming fluid. Well, she was not aware of Captain Gibbs and his suspicions. So in an interview with Papers, Gibbs said Jane would never use arsenic, but because it was too detectable, but preferred morphine and atropine since they were much harder to detect. So the prosecution ordered a second round of testing of the bodies, and they actually found both morphine and atropine in the bodies, which proved that it was Jane, because they also They also had a pharmacy owner testify that Jane had bought large amounts of morphine and atropine. And she had even stolen $500 off of Alden right after he died, like literally as he was cooling off. She took the money, which was the motive in the case for killing them. So in December 1901, she was officially charged with the murder of Alden Davis. So as the media dug into this while she was officially charged, they were able to find her cousin, Janet Snow, who revealed Jane's troubled childhood and even said Jane would never have done anything like this unless she had been insane. Like, there's no way. She has to be insane. So her cousin also mentioned on the stand that Jane's sister, the one that she had gone to the women's asylum with, had actually been put into an insane asylum. So she's got her father that was crazy, now her sister that's crazy. So they had psychiatrists evaluate Jane to see if she was legitimately crazy. And they decided that she was addicted to telling lies. And eventually she cracked under pressure and admitted that she had killed 11 people. She admitted that she got a sexual thrill when she climbed in bed with her victims as they took their last breath. So all of her victims, she liked to climb in bed and cuddle with them as they were dying because it gave her a sexual thrill. Ugh. Ooh, gross. So they decided that she was insane. And here's the quote. "If I had been a married woman, I probably would not have killed all those people. I would have had my husband, my children, and my home to take up my mind." But they deemed her as crazy, so she was found not guilty due to insanity. So she was actually sent to Taunton State Asylum, and she was the model inmate there. I guess they're not inmates, patients. She was the model patient there. She had good behavior, and she wrote to a psychiatrist, "I don't appear like these other patients. I can read a book intelligently. I don't have bad thoughts, so I don't see where moral degeneracy comes in." She did not think she belonged there and was hoping that her good behavior would get her out of the asylum. So once she realized that she was not getting out, she was writing letters to everyone saying, "You got to get me out of here. I don't belong here." She actually confessed. So I'm going to read you her confession. So after she realized she was not getting out, she confessed. She said, "I have given alienists and Herbert Parker, the names of 31 persons I killed, but as a matter of fact, I killed many more, whose names I can't recall. I think it would be safe to say I killed at least 100 from the time I became a nurse at a Boston hospital, where I killed the first one, until I ended the lives of the Davis family." So Jolly Jane admitted to killing over 100 people as a nurse. The people we are taught to trust. Like, oh. So, interesting enough, this happened to H.H. Holmes too. The later in life she got, the more paranoid she became, thinking that someone was going to try and poison her, try and kill her by poison, so she would stop eating. And she dropped from 200 pounds to 60 pounds because she was so worried that someone was going to poison her. H.H. Holmes did the same thing. He was worried someone was going to steal his body, so they had to bury him in cement and stuff. But she thought someone was out to get her and trying to poison her. It's interesting how their past come back and haunt them after so much time. And the paper even thought she was going to die, but soon she would make a miraculous recovery. But then she never got to leave the asylum. She died there in 1938 after spending her final years as an elderly patient, like the elderly patients that she did not like and chose to kill. How ironic. So, Jane's legacy, oh man, she makes me nervous about nurses. She tried her whole life to hide her Irish ancestry. She tried her whole life to be loved and accepted, but never felt the love of her adopted mother, which led her to killing the only person who truly cared about her, her sister. There have been, I actually looked this up because I was curious. There have actually been a few nurses since her time that have been serial killers. And these are people that we should be able to trust. Now, don't be afraid of nurses. I would say 99.99% of them are amazing. It's just these, like Jolly Jane, who is terrible. And, I think she's more despicable than H.H. Holmes, mostly because she got a sexual thrill out of killing her victims, climbing into bed with them and stroking their faces. Like, just gives me the heebie-jeebies. So, in my mind, she is way worse than H.H. Holmes, but I'm curious, what is your opinion? What do you think of Jolly Jane? Is she worse than H.H. Holmes? Is H.H. Holmes worse? It's hard. So I want to hear what you guys think. So a preview for next time, our next podcast episode is going to be about Idi Amin. I hope I'm saying his name right. His name is Idi Amin. In his first year as president of Uganda, it is estimated that he killed 10,000 people. And this happened in 1971 to 1979. So we are going to explore him and his horribleness in our next episode. So thank you so much for tuning in, guys. I hope you enjoyed the story of Jolly Jane Toppan, the murderous nurse, the angel of death, shall we say. So thanks for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you guys next time on HHH, those horrible humans in history. Thanks, guys. Bye.